Hello and welcome to this episode of the Geoeconomic Agenda, a podcast from the Institute of Geoeconomics at the Asia-Pacific Initiative in Tokyo that investigates the connections between economics, politics, business, and society. I'm your host, Paul Nadeau, and I'm a visiting researcher here at the IOG. Okay, today we're sitting down with Dimitry Rakin. He's an independent expert on Russia's economy. He was formerly with the economic desk at the Russian embassy in Tokyo. He's also been with the Economist Intelligence Unit and with a major multinational corporation. Dimitry, thanks so much for sitting down with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Paul. It's a pleasure.
So we're about 3 years past Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It was historic for all kinds of reasons, but one of those reasons was the almost unprecedented sanctions regime that was imposed on Russia after the invasion took place. So with 3 years in the rearview mirror, what can we say about the impact of that sanctions regime? What has it done to Russia's economy over those 3 years?
Thank you, Paul. It's a great start to have this conversation. I think from the very obvious first highest level analysis, definitely we can say that the impact of sanctions on Russia's economy, society, and politics has been profound. The last 3 years were, of course, a little bit different. And of course, the scale of sanctions got much larger. But we also have to remember that, and as you well know, that the sanctions has been in place basically since 2014 and for more than 10 years. So even at that time, I think from 2014, we can definitely see a different reality for Russia before that and after that. So it's like, we can say that from 1991, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, till 2014, that still was, even though there were lots of changes during the Putin's regime, the first 8 years, still this kind of 25 years were one reality. And after 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, after the start of the aggression against Ukraine, and then, of course, with the introduced first rounds of sanctions, the reality changed a lot for Russia's economy and society and for everyone. The last 3 years were, of course, much bigger impact. I think that at first few months after the invasion of Ukraine, we probably a little bit, as saying maybe, a kind of general expert, kind of community, whether in Russia or outside of it, maybe a little bit overestimated the potential impact. I think the first few months, like March, April 2022, there was a thinking that, as I think Alexashenko, one of the economists in Russian economists in West, said that the impact of new sanctions, the freezing of the assets, and all the other, they was like, he compared it to the impact of economic nuclear bomb. And I thought myself that I was thinking that perhaps a year or at best a couple years would be what was left of Russian economy. I think perhaps when thinking about the impact of the sanctions on economy, one thing, and when we're getting ready to this podcast, I was trying to think about it and distinguishing where the impact, what was the intended impact, what was the real impact, and also I think even thinking about what the word economy means here, right? Like what the Western actors, when imposing the sanctions, were saying that they want to hurt Russia's economy and really did that in a way. But I think there is a little bit even, and we can go maybe a little bit deeper in that further into discussion. What is the economy and what is like the order that the Western actors see as properly functioning economy and what Putin sees as the properly functioning economy. So I think the question is, was that, as again, some of the experts said, that Russian economy would collapse from the sanctions. In a certain way, we could say that if we define economy as the sort of typical neoliberal, democratic, the society where, democratically fully functional society with a modern type of post-industrialist economy. That type of economy, I think we can fairly say that type of economy did collapse in Russia. It's not globalized as it was before, that it's much more isolated. It has much fewer capacity in manufacturing. Larger and larger parts of the economy are based and are driven towards military sector. So it's like the conversion to what was happening in the Soviet times. But and all the other things down to the level of life and the consumer realities and everything. But if we define economy, if we ask, did that make that Russia stop all its manufacturing? Did it make for Russia to stop all economic activity in terms of producing enough resources to achieve the goals that the state poses? Then, so if we look at it from Putin's view, then we can say that the impact was there, but it did not produce the collapse of that economy. It did not produce the collapse of Russia, meaning it did not make it stop the actions that it was trying to do and that it is trying to do still. So I think, sorry for maybe being a bit vague and broad, but that would be the first introduction to what I would like to say.
Let's use that as a jumping off point to try to unpack their impact on the different elements of Russia's economy. I think you could probably break it down into things like, the war-making capacity, Putin's ability to govern, and then just, hitting the Russian economy writ large, as you sort of broke down. So maybe let's start with Russia's war-making capability. You would think that would have been one of the critical central factors in designing these, undermining Russia's ability to wage war in Ukraine. How have sanctions done in that regard?
Thank you. While not maybe the biggest military expert myself, so let me try to see from what the analysis that I saw and what I saw in the last 3 years. Definitely, when trying to, for example, limit the usage, the export to Russia, the high level, the sophisticated electronic equipment, and the other types of obviously all the dual use equipment. At the first place that generally was successful at the level of not for Russia not being able to produce and procure this, at least from the official channels. The limiting of Russia's capability to buy this equipment from other actors that are not supporting the sanctions. As we know, there's quite a number of countries who did not join that, and also, of course, Russia's strong, a little bit maybe complicated, but still strong relationship with countries like China and the others who were, again, maybe a little bit more supportive. Iran, of course, that did help Russia to get some of that equipment that they couldn't, get from the West. So to a certain extent, I think that had obvious effect on Russia's war military capabilities. I think without these sanctions, it would have been much more difficult for Ukraine. I do think that what we saw in these 3 years, how Russia was, not successful the first round of just trying to invade and capture Ukraine, but then more generally had a very protracted and not always successful reality in how the things were going for them, military speaking, in Ukraine. I do think that a lot of that was down to the fact that it was much more difficult, was getting more and more difficult for Russia to get the right equipment, to substitute this equipment, and then a lot of what Russia had to do was just the same old tactics of substituting the equipment with just people resources, right? Basically the same story of any other major Russian war, where having difficulties with the equipment, just threw more and more people, more and more soldiers, and trying to kind of win through the attrition. So I think that effect was sizable, and the fact that Russia had to move more and more of its own capabilities, more and more of its own economy into military sector. Right now, I think in the last year, the estimated was about almost a third of the economy already in more or less way being kind of focused only on the military capabilities. That is also a proof that it could not procure the resources. It could not get the right resources from the other countries. Then I think on the other hand, of course, the impact of any kind of restrictions on technology can only be limited in the modern world. I think a lot of the analysis done by other think tanks like Carnegie and the others pointed out very well that in modern world, even the consumer level, even the everyday devices like dishwashers or whatever, would have a sophisticated enough equipment that it can be used for military purposes with some engineering, with some adaptation.
Dual use dishwashers.
So I think that's I read the analysis that showed that some of the recovered equipment from the Russian military in Ukraine showed that they were adapting literally just the parts of everyday, definitely non-war focused, non-war machinery, such as I think including washing machines and dishwashers and things like that. Some of the parts of it, employing that, using that in like drones and whatnot. And even if we look at the drones themselves, right, the military drones, they're not a very sophisticated machine as I understand. Like I'm not an engineer, but I do understand that it's not the same as building a functioning rocket or even a tank. A lot of that, as we also know from, I don't know, again, Iran living with sanctions for a long time, developed the capabilities to do that. We saw a lot of this kind of clandestine, a lot of this sort of almost DIY level military equipment from, I don't know, terrorists in the Middle East and some of the other countries. With the technology at the level where it is today, it's very easy to substitute. So. And then, of course, other countries that didn't join it. And then, of course, all the shadow economy that just ballooned after sanctions and all the unofficial channels through which Russian companies and Russian state procures the equipment. It's just the fact that you cannot stop it. Like you cannot block the technological equipment from entering Russia. And on the other hand, as I also pointed out in the first part of my reply, even if the actor can, theoretically procure an equipment or a certain thing that they need to, there is still another part of required to make the deal happen. They need to have the means to buy it, right? So where the impact of sanctions was also felt, right, was obviously the limiting capabilities of Russia to spend internationally, to have enough resources. And that's where the broader impact on economy is, of course, huge. Now, I think that what a lot of analysis pointed out from the beginning, if you're looking at the Russian economy, everyone knows that it's dependent on the export of natural resources, primarily oil and gas and the other carbohydrates, right? So I think with the latest rounds of sanctions that we're getting more and closer to the oil exports from Russia, specifically targeting and going very granular. I'm talking about the last round of sanctions from the Biden administration, looking at the shadow fleet of tankers. That is where I think the biggest impact, and that's where we saw in the last few months a lot of nervousness and a lot of real understanding that if Russia, at the end of the day, if Russia is not able to get enough resources through selling its oil and gas and the other resources, eventually and quite soon the resources for war will also be depleted, and it would not be possible to procure the right equipment and to continue.
it sounds like we're close to a tipping point, perhaps. If you really crack down on the shadow fleets and the other ways of circumventing sanctions, you might finally get the Russian government to a point where it can no longer maintain the war effort. Is that fair to say?
I think that is definitely where we are currently, even I think, still heading to, right? So it's because we don't know exactly what will happen with the next moves by the Trump administration, and everything is quite unpredictable.
Putting it mildly.
More targeted, yes, exactly. More targeted and focused efforts that would really make the Russian government and Russia more broadly, a Russian war machine, not functioning is where we need to go, where just in general, the world, where we need to go to if we want to stop the Russian aggression. It all boils down to the question of what do we want to achieve with the sanctions, right? If we want to limit the capabilities, if we want to make it more difficult, and if we're maybe not, if the Western countries were not ready to go all in terms of understanding that the impact of limiting Russia's oil and gas exporting capabilities would eventually also hurt the Western countries as well, with all the effect for energy security and everything. Perhaps that was one of the reasons why I know a lot of people were hesitant. A lot of people were worried in 2022, genuinely worried whether we will have enough resources even here in Japan or in some of the Western or Central Europe countries. Will there be enough resources to substitute for Russian oil and gas, for some of the other resources that Russia is exporting? Will it be possible, especially in the times where it's the peak capabilities for energy sector? But if we are arriving at a point where we understand that if we do not, as we see with these 3 years and with very obvious behavior by Putin, not willing to stop, I think we can be fairly clear that he doesn't want to stop just at these territories that he already has in Ukraine, and very likely not stopping at the Ukraine itself. So if we now see that what actually needs to be done is a much more serious approach of the impact of sanctions must be more towards not making it possible for them to continue at all, right? Then that's where the sanctions against oil and gas and a very, very specific, targeted, sophisticated list of measures is needed to make it not happen. I think the effect was quite profound already. 2024, I think was whatever we see the official figures, even the official figures in like the GDP growth they're not the brightest. They are definitely overblown. A lot of that is just a lot of the so-called economic growth in Russia is just down to the military equipment building and all that, which is very, very different from, again, fully functioning real normal economy. So that's already, even from official point of view, not really bright and not really good and promising. We know that it's been getting sort of more and more difficult for the general population to cope with it, and at the fourth quarter, with the bank rates that we see now, the inflation, which is again officially admitted by the Russian government as a real problem, as the biggest problem, and with the central bank not being able to control the inflation where it is today, right? Even with the rates that are now at the crazy level, which basically makes it impossible to talk about any kind of long-term normal economic activity, with the bank rates of up northwards from 20%, and inflation, even official inflation, about 10% and growing. That is already, I think, where a lot of people started to feel the pressure very, very close to home. I heard from a lot of people. I haven't been to Russia for a long time, but what I hear from people who are there still working at the either state or not non-state independent actors in Russia, it is getting more and more difficult, specifically in the last sort of half a year.
How do you define difficult exactly? I'm sorry to interrupt, but when they say it's difficult, What kind of factors are they pointing at? What do they mean exactly when they say it's getting difficult?
I think a lot of that, well, obviously what I see and what I hear is just the level of resources, the access to capital funds, to money. So for even the first couple of years, there was enough in the Russian government itself and in a lot of companies, a lot of so-called private sector, well, a lot of, as you know, especially again in the natural resource world, oil and gas companies, largely just being state companies. They had enough resources, so they had enough capital that they were able to survive this first couple of years. Because Russian government saw where Russian economy was heading, because Putin saw what was happening, how it was happening, and how he wanted to continue. He used all the time from 2014, and even before that, he used that to build the base. He used it to have enough resources inside Russia, make it less sufficient on foreign markets, on foreign capital, and make it much more independent, and have enough resources inside the country, have enough foreign reserves and whatnot.
But building a war economy effectively.
Doing that for a long time, getting ready for this, and for the first few years of the war as it was, that was enough. That was still that they were still living through this. Now, come today, where after that unnatural couple years, of course, you get overheated economy, which is not functioning normally. So some sectors of it are booming, others stop completely. You have a very destabilized situation with the exchange rate, with the access to foreign capitals. Even the communication and information, to a certain extent, getting more and more limited with how both the Russian government itself trying to limit access to resources through the internet and other channels, and some of these companies and services leaving Russia. So more and more, this destabilization, again, in the modern, sophisticated economical activity, eventually leads to a point where it gets more and more difficult for you. And then you have the more and more difficult for you to continue your activities, with eventual compound effect drawing near, right? So you can work, you can sprint through the mobilization, but through this sort of tough times and everything. But it's very difficult to do a marathon like that. So what I saw in the last year was more and more sort of hesitation towards how much the companies that are working in Russia will be able to continue, how much of that would still be functioning in the next year or two. The military resources themselves and the military operations were also getting, as you see, right, after the first kind of very heated months of war, very, very protracted, very cautious even in a lot of ways, where trying to, at first, working in Russian interests, trying to sort of prolong this, to prolong the war itself and prolong the sufferings for Ukraine's economy, first and foremost, and for, maybe to a lesser extent, European countries also having a certain impact of sanctions on them. But of course, for Ukraine first and foremost. First, it was in Russian interests to have this in a longer as possible, but we are getting to a point where it's starting to hurt Russia much bigger. There were already an analysis and estimates as to thinking that maybe perhaps another 12 months is what the Russian economy will have to continue to support and make it possible to make war. But tipping point is close, I would say.
So what would you say is necessary to push everything over that tipping point? Is it just a question of time? Are there still gaps in the sanctions regime? that could be filled up and blocked? What do you think?
I think the gaps are still there, even the potential for sanctions to become more targeted, more focused on certain sectors of economy, such as first and foremost, it's about limiting limiting the revenues from oil and gas for the government. That's, I think, by far the biggest. We still have, and even aside of that, there are still financial institutions that are fully functioning. Not all the banks are covered by the ban on SWIFT. Again, we understand. Everyone would understand that all these measures, they would have effect not only just on Russia, and that's why a lot of people are hesitant to go into that in that territory to get to the point where it would, to hurt Russia, you also have to suffer a little bit of the economic or social consequences. But I think that looking at it from today, we have to understand that the negative effects from the sanctions on Russia will be there, whatever, even today, they are there. But we need to there needs to be a decision on whether we want to actually make this stop, make it difficult for Russia to expand its aggression, and make some tough choices. Of course, no one wants to, and I don't think we need to fully accept the logic of the world where it's only about war kind of terminology and friend or foe, zero-sum games. That's what Putin world is, and I don't think it would be a good idea for everyone to just start thinking from the in the same sort of mobilization of the economy towards war kind of thinking. What needs to happen is a much more serious discussion on what the countries that are now operating with Russia, that are Russia's neighbors, that are Russia's biggest partners, that are the biggest economies in the world. The question of what do they want to achieve, and how would they see the world as after, for example, Putin, after the war stops. Because I think we need to start thinking kind of from a little bit further up. We need to start thinking not just for the next few months or next action. For example, okay, we were able to stop, with certain next measure, next economic sanctions, the Russian government is no longer able to funnel this money into war efforts and stops aggression towards Ukraine. But that cannot be the only reason for the sanctions, for the overall sort of diplomacy and international order towards Russia. There has to be a discussion on what is it exactly that there needs to be to achieve. How will the world operate, and how will it work with Russia after the war? What will it look like? Do we just want to go back to the business as usual, which I think a lot of, even the people who backed the sanctions, introduced the sanctions, a lot of people would gladly go back to normal, right? Would gladly just see as that the war stops. Let's just continue doing business with Russia as it was. Is that the right approach? We have to go a little bit, both further in time to think about what would the next 5-10 years look, but we also have to look a little bit behind in 10-20 years before. How much of the business and diplomacy that the Western countries were doing with Russia, how much of that was actually helping Putin to build these capabilities to make the war happen? What actions of the Western governments, what actions, what of their actions were enabling Putin to become more bolden, and which actions were actually making it more harder for him to exercise his power. I think there needs to be a big discussion, an analysis done on what was achieved through this last few decades, and how we arrived at this point, what we want to get out of Russia, how we want to live and work with the next Russian government, or with the same Russian government if it stops the war. Would it be say, for example, hypothetically, Putin agrees, he will never do that, but if he agrees to pull out the forces from the areas that he captured now, but he keeps Crimea. Is that, can we say that this is like something acceptable or not? Would it, and if we lift some of the sanctions from them, or even stop adding new sanctions after that, would that be a good idea or not? What would that look like, and would that mean that we just give you more time to regroup, or we can hope that something changes in Russia, or what would it be? Because I think now, when we're talking about tipping point, which I think, yes, I do think that 1 or 2 more years of this growing pressure in Russian economy would eventually work. I think that's fair to say, and it's difficult to see otherwise. But even if that happens, what is the next move? What is the next step towards this, the next world order, or at least European security? I think there's not enough discussion on that. Of course, with Trump administration and things being a little bit hectic, maybe we can say that it's not, the first agenda or something, or that it's, we don't have the luxury to sit and hypothesize about it. Still, I think it's necessary, and especially with how there will be a lot of discussion about the talks with Russia, potential deal, and whatnot. Which again, I think prospects are still, we're miles away from anything specific there. But we need more serious discussion on what this next step would be for Japan as well. I think for Japan it is one of the big priorities of the international relations of Japan. Obviously, having Russia as the biggest neighbor as an important part of Japan's energy security. I think there is not enough discussion about it, which needs to change.
I think we'll end on that point. This has been really insightful, Dimitry. Thank you so much for joining us today. And obviously, we're going to keep watching this space for a while to come, unfortunately. But thank you for your insights. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
This is the Geoeconomics Agenda with Paul Nadeau. Finally, in honor of Super Bowl 59, though not in honor of the outcome, a reflection on the role of Roman numerals. For some reason, Super Bowls, the championship game in American football, aren't listed by year but by their sequence in Roman numerals, which made the branding for the most recent Super Bowl read Super Bowl 59 and not, as 3-time Super Bowl champion Rob Gronkowski liked to say, Super Bowl licks. But to be fair to Gronk, the Super Bowl is one of the few instances where we encounter Roman numerals. The Romans contributed a lot to civilization, like legal codes and architectural innovations, but Europe wasn't able to develop financially until it discarded Roman numerals and replaced them with Arabic numerals. That's because Roman numerals may look fancy, but they're not very practical. There's no notation for zero, there are differing ways of writing large numbers, and simple calculations are cumbersome. In fact, Google AI told me that the best way to add Roman numerals together is to convert them to Arabic numerals, add them, and then convert them back to Roman numerals. That's because it's much easier to do calculations in Arabic numerals. We do that every day. The oldest examples of Arabic numerals are from Egypt, but their modern form seems to have been developed in Al-Andalus, the Islamic-led region of what's now modern Spain, around 900 AD. Northern Europeans first encountered these numerals from there, but it took time for them to be adopted more widely. For that, credit probably goes to Leonardo Fibonacci, an Italian mathematician who studied in what's now Algeria in his youth. His book, the Liber Abazi, or Book of Calculations, described the advantages of doing calculations with Arabic numerals rather than Roman numerals, specifically the ability to calculate large numbers quickly, the use of zero, using fractions, calculating algebraic equations, and more. The use of Arabic numerals in Europe took off from there. But they were important for Europe's commercial development because of what they could facilitate. Calculating larger numbers more quickly means you're now able to calculate larger transactions more quickly, enabling you to do more commerce and expand your commercial growth. This helped initiate the rise of merchant republics of Italy like Venice and Genoa, and along with other innovations, helped triple northern Italy's income from the 1000s to the 1500s. Roman numerals are fine for Super Bowl and grandfather clocks, but there's a good reason why we moved on. That's all for this episode, but stay tuned for more on the way. Until then, we want to talk about what you want to hear about, as well as take your questions for our show. So send us an email at geoeconomicagenda@ihj.global. Be sure to like, rate, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, tell your friends, and most of all, keep listening. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to the team at API for making this happen, and we'll talk to you next time.